Hey everyone, welcome to MPOS. I'm your host Nora. Today I'm excited to welcome Matt Schaar, who will share his insights on aerospace venture capital and fintech. Matt is the operating partner of Accion Venture Lab. He leads Venture Lab's portfolio engagement and platform function. Prior to this, Matt held product marketing and customer success leadership roles at Salesforce and GitHub, helping GitHub get an eventual $7.5 billion acquisition by Microsoft. He also advised a variety of companies as an independent consultant with the Boston Consulting Group. He earned a Bachelor's in Aerospace Engineering, an MBA, and a master's degree in public policy, all from the University of Michigan. In this episode, Matt shared his journey from studying aerospace to making a significant impact in the venture capital and fintech sectors. He also talked about his key learnings at Salesforce and GitHub and his current role as an operating partner of Accion Venture Lab. His advice for young professionals transitioning into those fields is very inspiring to me. I hope you enjoy this episode. Let's get right into it. Hey Matt, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your experience in venture capital. We're really excited to hear about your advice for the young people as well. I wonder, to start off, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat today. My name is Matt Schaar. I am the operating partner at Accion Venture Lab. We're an early stage fintech venture fund based here in Washington, D.C., although we have a staff that's across the globe. Within my role, I lead our strategic and operational post-investment support for our portfolio companies within the fintech space, but also anything related to external communications, community, to our outside perspective as a fund also falls under my purview. I've been at Venture Lab just for over 4 years at this point, after spending a few years in Silicon Valley, working in a variety of product roles at a few early stage and later stage tech companies. But of course, the most important thing is I went to Michigan as an undergrad. I was there first for my engineering degree and then went back a few years later and got an MBA and a Master of Public Policy. And I was at the national championship game this year, so my Michigan fandom is at its peak at the moment. So always great to chat with folks in the Michigan community, and obviously go blue.
That sounds great. So for the start part, we want to hear more about your Michigan memories. So can you tell us one thing about your Michigan memory here, and how that influenced your current position?
Sure. Well, I think Michigan has been just an absolutely formative place in my life. As mentioned, I was in Ann Arbor for just about 7 years, getting my degrees there, and spent some time living in Detroit after my second time in Ann Arbor. Yeah, it really was something that shaped and molded me into the person I am today, not just professionally, but personally. I grew up in a semi-rural town in South Dakota, and coming to Michigan with just an incredible representation of states and countries, of people of all different types of backgrounds, really gave me a glimpse in the world that I had never had before. And so I think in many ways that was a formative experience for me in really identifying how it is I wanted to live my life. I saw the world as much bigger than I think I had seen it before. And I think that's rang true in what I've explored and pursued. And I have so much to be grateful to the university for really imprinting those things in me, and how they have really played out.
Yeah, definitely. And we know that you learn aerospace engineering, but later transition to tech area. So we're curious how that transition is and what's the most rewarding thing for you to learn the aerospace engineering major?
Yeah, certainly. So I knew I wanted to study aerospace when I came to Michigan. Actually, when I applied to colleges, I was looking specifically at their aerospace programs, and Michigan's is really one of the best, and has a long list of alumni who have done some really groundbreaking things in the aerospace industry. And I think the intensity of the program, just being very quantitatively heavy, was something I expected from that. But I also think something I learned within that was the value of how to really build and how to collaborate with your classmates. A lot of our design and research efforts were not done individually, but as teams. And so really understanding not only the concept of how to analyze those challenges, but then also how to communicate them, and really persuade and influence your classmates, but also your professors on those topics was something that I gained a really great knowledge for. And when I looked for my first engineering jobs, even when I had internships as an undergrad, I think I found that the balance of those two things was really important for me in a job. I didn't want to just be doing analysis and deep quantitative work. I really also wanted to have a chance to problem solve alongside others. So my first job out of Michigan was as a design engineer for aircraft engines. And that, my responsibility was not only to think of ways to improve existing products, but then also if there was a manufacturing problem on the shop floor, I was out there inspecting the part, identifying ways to fix it, and then also presenting my findings back to engineering managers and a technical audience that would really help influence decisions that were made down the road. And I think being able to really learn how to do that, create that balance of quantitative analysis and delivering those messages was something I learned even in my early stages in my undergraduate studies. And I think that's carried over into as an investor, there's always a combination of analysis and persuasion.
Yeah, that's really cool and that's really inspiring for those engineering students as well. So we know that you also like get exposure in GitHub and Salesforce and more about business area. Do you want to talk more about that, like the work you did there and what's the most like rewarding part?
Yeah, certainly. So when I was at GitHub and Salesforce, both of those roles actually were with similar products. They both were designed for a more developer-centric audience. So these were software engineers that ultimately were using GitHub, and at Salesforce when I was working on the Heroku team, were really using these tools to make their lives and their day-to-day work more effective and efficient. GitHub being the most popular platform on which to build software products. And at the time I was there, I don't remember how many users we had, but I know it's now much higher than that, 10 years later. But I think what was really exciting about it was that this was a product that, you really had to explain and sell to a pretty technical audience. So being able to speak to its characteristics and its ability of how to really make their lives and their work more productive is equally challenging, but also exciting. My role at GitHub started out actually, I joined in their customer success team. So this was at a time where GitHub was only about 150 people. They had just raised a round of funding a few years prior, or a year or so prior. And they were really just looking to expand their team that would help after the sale was made, and particularly for enterprise clients. So these enterprise customers would have ranging from 2 engineers to up to 2,000 engineers using GitHub within their organizations. My responsibility was really to nurture that relationship. So when it came to technical challenges that their team was facing, I'd be there to really field those calls and identify ways to solve those challenges by working with my team internally at GitHub. So working with engineers, product managers, sales engineers, a variety of different folks. And then what I learned after about a year or so is I really enjoyed, I think, the storytelling aspect of that. I loved communicating the value of the product, but also identifying ways to make the product better that could translate into actual product development. So I transitioned over and helped build GitHub's product marketing team. And what we did in product marketing was a way to identify the different customer segments and personas that GitHub either was currently serving or was looking to serve, and then really beginning to identify the different types of features and product solutions that GitHub could build to tailor to those particular customers. The reality is that you don't want to build for every type of customer. And so part of that is also identifying from an economic and business perspective, what are the customers that we should prioritize, where we put more energy into marketing and trying to draw those customers into utilizing the product, as opposed to customers that may not be as high value add. So these are all things that I think having that technical foundation and being able to communicate to those audiences about the product and translating it over into how that turns into economic value for the company was something that I really honed when I was at GitHub. And then that was essentially a similar sort of work that I did when I moved over to Heroku and Salesforce.
That sounds really diverse. And now you transit from a startup perspective to a venture lab that helps more people. As we know that you're currently the operating partner at Accion Venture Lab. Do you want to talk us more about what you are currently doing and how you help those startups to grow?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the biggest shift is after having spent time in Silicon Valley and also working with some investors who are on our cap table at places like GitHub, I really saw there was opportunity to deliver value from the investor perspective. I think that the natural belief is an investor or a venture fund gives you money, and then you as a founder just go and utilize that money. There's a lot more that goes into it though, because number one is that there's a financial responsibility that a founder has to ultimately trying to make good on that capital that's been raised. And the other part of that too is if you want to try to help these founders be most successful, you need to think about what are the lessons that you've learned as an investor that can be shared across with your founders and also more broadly the entire industry that enables them to just do their work better and become more effective and hopefully deliver on the outcomes that they set out to do as founders. So really our work falls into a couple different buckets at Venture Lab and in the operating space, but it's all under this umbrella we call portfolio engagement and platform. The first part of that portfolio engagement, this is where we do real deep engaging work with our portfolio companies. And really before we invest in these companies, we're already beginning to assess what are some of the pathways that we see for these types of companies and this type of business model to succeed. Given the fact we've invested in over 70 companies at this point across the world, we've seen a lot of different models, including ones we've not invested in. And so we can see where there are particular areas that they need to really shore up in order to be successful. So we begin to look at that and we see where we believe that this team and this particular business model is going to be strong in those areas and which are the ones in which we think our knowledge can really come in and help solve those challenges. So what we do is once we invest in a company, we actually will structure out a short-term project with our founders of the company. And we'll map out a few different work streams, and they relate from things to how you're building out your product strategy, your go-to-market plans, customer segmentation. We'll also look at things like pricing. We'll get into some more focused topics around fintech, like credit policy and underwriting and how you're thinking of those sorts of dimensions. But then we'll also look at things like team and culture. And really, we work with a founder to prioritize those topics. And that translates into roughly a 4 to 5 week engagement we do with the founders. With a week of that, usually we spend on time on the ground with their companies. And hopefully in that time, we also get a chance to meet with some of their customers and just get a better flavor for what type of day-to-day customer that they are serving with their services and their solutions. So from that, it's the idea is we're really helping position them to become successful, draw in more capital, grow, expand, and succeed. That's the premise around portfolio engagement. Platform is where we take those learnings and we think of ways to really bring that out to the world. So it's how we communicate some of our thought leadership, the lessons we've learned from these types of projects. It's podcasts. It's also having hosting convenings amongst our founders. Because one thing we discovered is not only do we have this real deep repository of knowledge, also our founders have tons of lessons learned, in many cases more than we have. And so what we also try to find is opportunities to bring our founders together and really learn from each other and bounce ideas off of one another in ways that we just help facilitate because they're in the trenches. They understand what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And in many ways, we just want to be the connection point between those two. So that's really where like the core elements of our work in supporting our founders and the broader fintech industry as a whole fits into.
Yeah, we also know that Accion Venture Lab focuses on more about fintech investment. So could you share what's the key criteria when you're doing those investments?
Certainly. So for us, because we're also early stage investors, we look at we're oftentimes the first institutional check that goes into a portfolio company. It means that the type of metrics and the way that we assess a company oftentimes requires a combination of art and science. The science part of it is these companies have hopefully begun to identify potential product market fit. They've started to see traction with particular customer segments. And they've also laid out a bit of a vision on how they see that continue to grow. The challenge with that, though, is that there's not a lot of that data as if a company that's been, publicly traded for a long time that's required to really publish information. There's not always a lot of priors that we can go off. So that's where the art comes in, is we also really have to assess, do we believe that this team is one that is capable of executing on these goals they have? Do we think it's the right team that can build the type of product? Do they have that local market knowledge to deliver on this as well? But also, who are the other investors coming into this round, into this deal? There's a lot of factors that are taken into play. And what I would say is that really it's the whole sum of the narrative that we have to look at when it comes to deciding whether or not we invest in a company or not. The other thing I'll mention too is that we all are an investor that focuses on financial inclusion. And so one of our mandates as a fund, and really Accion more broadly as an organization, is that we believe right now there are roughly 2 billion individuals who do not have access to basic financial services. So they can't open a bank account. If they run a small business, they can't get a loan. We also estimate there's roughly a $5 trillion funding gap for small businesses around the world. And we believe that our mission is not only to invest in innovative fintechs, but also to solve both that funding and financial access gap for individuals and small businesses. So really the most important aspect of any company we look at is, are they building a solution in a market that we've identified a clear need for trying to benefit the financially excluded? And that's also why when you look at the investments we've made, a large majority of them have been outside of traditionally well-established financial markets like the United States and Europe. Because of the fact that there's a lot more informal sectors in these particular markets that small businesses have had to go to, or individuals have had to go to try to access the financial services they need to thrive and make a living for themselves. So, that really is central to our thesis. And we've tailored the way that we look at these companies to make sure we're accounting for that, not just at the end, but really in every part of our diligence process.
Yeah, I really appreciate you share about your investment philosophy, and really love the concept of arts plus science. And sounds like a lot of the companies in your portfolio has a huge social impact of helping people who don't have the access to the financial institutions. I just really want to dive deep into how do you approach advisory and supporting those companies in your portfolio, especially at the early stage. Could you give us an example about how you utilize your working experience in GitHub or Salesforce to help those companies grow?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the areas that we've invested a bit more into over the past few years is what I call verticalized software as a service, or verticalized SaaS. We believe that by utilizing SaaS as a platform to enable accessible financial services, it actually is one of the ways you do create financial inclusion. So as an example, if you think about a software platform where small businesses and enterprises are engaging with each other, and there's a lot of transactional data that exists between those two entities, you can use that data to underwrite those small businesses in ways that you normally could not. So in ways that you have a credit score or a bureau that some entity within the government will manage, that can provide one glimpse into the credit worthiness of the company. Banks now have an additional layer of knowledge. They can look at invoices and recognize that there is a degree of financial health that shows up just in those transactions that are taking place. So this is a really exciting, I think, frontier in how I think financial services are going to be delivered in the future, especially in these frontier markets. And one of the topics that comes up often with these companies is, okay, I have this software platform. I come from a banking background. How much should I charge my customer for this platform? This is precisely what I worked on when I was at GitHub and when I was at Salesforce, is thinking how to effectively price products, how you message that, the different tiers of pricing that you utilize for customers, but then also what variable you use to adjust that pricing. And in a very similar fashion, a lot of our portfolio companies are selling to mid-sized businesses, but also could be selling all the way up to enterprises. And all of them have different variables around which you adjust your pricing. And so for them, being able to go through that exercise with bringing that knowledge I had from working at GitHub, I think has been really powerful for them. Also, it's just been I think it's been a good knowledge addition to our team, because I think we recognize that we had a very solid history as having knowledge of various fintech metrics, having invested in a lot of companies that are doing credit in these sorts of dimensions. So bringing in this layer of SaaS knowledge, I think has also helped us, because we know that those two worlds are going to be much more closely coupled together in the future.
We all know that doing venture capital investments includes a lot of risks. So I wonder, could you share a particular challenging investment decisions that you have made and how you navigate it in both the financials and the social impact perspectives?
Yeah, well, I think I can probably speak to it more broadly, because I think there's a lot of elements, I think, of risk that go into this. The first one is at the point of decision making around the investment. And this is where we try to run diligence as effectively as possible, but you're right that the information is not always fully transparent. So I think what we try to do in that front is make sure that we have covered every single step we possibly can, from assessing the business, projecting the numbers, the legal elements of it all, the financial, the regulatory elements of all this, and especially being global investors, the regulatory environment is changing from day to day. So we have to make sure we're really on top of that challenge. But I would say that the real challenge is helping these companies survive, right? And making sure that they actually can succeed. And this is a combination of a few things I mentioned before. It can be a team question, and how we help, and the team is facing their own challenges. It's changes in the business model, or finding that the initial hypothesis around the business model has not panned out in the way that is expected. But that can be a combination of internal factors, like it wasn't marketed effectively. They couldn't find the right type of sales channels. It also can be macro level. There's a lot of factors outside of their control that also are ones that need to be accounted for. And then I think the other dimension of that too is impact. And I think sometimes what we see is that the type of customer that is historically underbanked or underserved, I think there's a bit of a hypothesis that is not quite correct, in that you cannot monetize these types of customers, or there's no way to actually build a profitable business by delivering financial services to an underbanked or underserved customer. We've seen time and time again that we don't believe that is true, and it's evidenced by the success of our portfolio. But there are some cases in which I think the draw to try to move more up market to higher paying customers is a very common thing as well. And so I think I'd say that the difficulties around that is just navigating all of those things. I think we as an industry tend to really celebrate the announcements of investments, but I always tend to think about it's like celebrating someone for getting a mortgage on their house or getting a bank to give you a loan for your tuition. You got to pay it back, right? And you have to make good on that note. And so I think that's really where the hard work fits in, but also I think it's really fulfilling work, because when it does succeed and you see these companies thrive, and you also get to see millions of people lifted out of financial insecurity, that's really where the value, I think, fits in and makes the job really quite rewarding.
Absolutely. Another common thing that we notice is that a lot of successful venture capital investors like you have an MBA degree before they fully dive into the investment world. So we wonder, at which point of your career did you decide to do an MBA, and how did your business administration and public policy degree help your success in the venture capital industry?
Yeah, I was at Boeing doing engineering work when I decided to go back and get my MBA. And really it stemmed, I think, out of a couple of areas. The first one is I had a couple of acquaintances who were working in the consulting space, and they had engineering backgrounds, but I think they were doing like a lot of really diverse types of work within their firms. And I combined that with the other thing that was happening is that I was really beginning to test out this idea of how business and society would coexist, how it is that business could be utilized as a catalyst for effective social change. And I frankly knew nothing about how those two worlds would coexist. And so I realized that there were a lot of different ways that I would need to figure that out, but it seemed like the most intuitive one was to go back to business school. And also alongside that, and when I was fortunate enough to get into Michigan, I told myself, I'm also going to go and spend some time over at the Ford School. And I'm about 75% sure I want to go get a public policy degree because I feel like that's where I think I could really test this out a bit more. It was also the fact that one of the books I was reading at the time was by a professor at Columbia's School for International and Public Affairs. And I felt like, okay, this person seems to also think through these things in ways that I want to think about the world. So maybe it makes sense for me to also look at it from a policy perspective. And when I got on campus and met the Ford School faculty and a few folks there, it just made intuitive sense. I think the things I wanted to learn were going to take a bit longer than a 2-year business degree was going to allow me for. So I wanted to spend an extra year on campus regardless. And so, yeah, I think that really kind of set the foundation where I was wanting to raise these questions. I think my answer was a resounding yes, I think at the end of it all. And this was also at the time where there was a lot of things emerging around clean tech and utilizing and new technologies that you could build businesses out of. And so I think that's always been a factor I've carried through. And I would also, it's taken me a bit of time. I wasn't focused a lot on business and society emerging, when I was at BCG, when I was in tech. I really do believe that my time in the past 4 years at Accion has been the place where those things have all come together in a fashion that they hadn't yet before. So to see that come full circle, and even though it took 9 years after I left campus, I think I also learned that it's not always going to come immediately, but that's also okay. It can be a bit of a topsy-turvy pathway to get there.
That's really wonderful. Our last question before we get into the rapid fire is we want to hear about your advice to the young people who are looking to transition into venture capital or fintech industry without those backgrounds.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that one can do is to form your own personal thesis. I think it's good to go in knowing, and I think a lot of venture funds, when they look to add people to their teams, really do look for someone who's thought through the reasons why they want to particularly invest under the auspices of the types of companies that fund invests into, and also that they want to invest at that stage. What a seed stage venture fund does in fintech is very different from what a Series C fund does in fintech. It's important to know the differences between those and at what point you actually want to, if you're someone that really wants to spend more time really diving into the unknown of a company, that's where like seed stage fits in, whereas Series C is more of like you're just investing for growth and you're trying to help them, scale to a point of mega success as opposed to just a success. So it's helpful to know those differences. So I'd say that on the venture side is just kind of think through understanding the dimensions, the differences between those, and where you really fit in is really important. I think fintech is a very flexible and forgiving place in that it's not so narrowly focused as I think a lot of people perceive it to be. Because within fintech, you could be doing insurance, banking, you could be doing regulatory stuff, you could be doing banking as a service. Like there's so many different ways you can think about where fintech fits in. And kind of the same fashion I said around like thinking where you really want to carve out a space in venture, I'd say the same with fintech is try to make that tent a little bit smaller. I think going in with curiosity, I think is helpful. But I think it's also important to know, like, if you know that you're operating within like a particular or a couple of different verticals within fintech, you can kind of navigate around what type of role you want to take on, whether it's more customer oriented, product oriented, engineering oriented. But the differences between an engineer in reg tech and an engineer in banking can oftentimes be quite widely variant. So it's more important to think about like what kind of areas of fintech you really want to dive into. So those would be the two pieces of advice I'd give to anyone looking at it.
So would you recommend people to just dive in this industry and figure out which subsector or specific area they want to work on by like getting into this first, or you would recommend some other ways to figure out first?
Yeah, I think there's just like a wealth of knowledge out there. It's looking at how companies operate. It's looking at someone like Mercury as a financial institution, but then also looking at someone like Modern Treasury or looking at Unit. These big fintechs that exist that have a lot of information shared across about them. What are the things you like about that? When you look at their product journey, what excites you about that as opposed to other companies? I think just getting a better sense of those types of challenges you think they're solving that you find yourself really drawn to, that I think it's a really good signal for I think where you might want to fit in.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you also mentioned the personal success is really important. Before you dive into, you have to come up with your own story. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
The last part we want to do is 3 rapid fire questions. We didn't put that on the question list, so it'd be a little bit surprising.
I know. I'm a little scared.
Right.
Let's do it.
The first one is very easy. Could you share one of your favorite books or one of the books that you recently read?
Yes, the one that comes to mind is The Overstory by Richard Powers.
Great. Could you share one of the investors that you really, really like?
Yeah, he's actually not investing anymore, but his name is Charlie O'Donnell. He was a partner at Brooklyn Bridge Ventures. He started out his career he's at a couple other funds based in New York. Love his writing, love his perspective on the world. He pulls no punches, and I appreciate that about him.
That's wonderful. If you can have a dinner with anyone in the world, who would you pick?
It's hard. Okay. Gosh, I actually think I'd sit down with Greta Thunberg because I think for someone to be thrust into the spotlight at such a young age and also like whose perspectives have been formed and shaped by her public presence, I would just love to hear more around like I'd love to learn more about how her brain ticks.
That's
Yeah,
amazing. I love that. Well, that's the end of this episode. Thank you so much, Matt, for being here today on this episode. We really appreciate your time and sharing about all your advice and your experiences.
of course. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.